Buick was always about luxury until the day they released this dark monster. From being a powerful beast to becoming the reason behind corporate fights, the Buick GNX ended up becoming the most iconic hip-hop car of all time. But the story started way before hip-hop brought it to fame. Perhaps the most problematic car GM had to deal with. This is the story of the 1987 Buick GNX. By 1982, General Motors was undergoing a massive corporate shift. The era of the big rear-wheel drive American cruiser was officially ending. Fuel economy regulations and a shift toward European-style efficiency meant that GM's future was front-wheel drive. The G-body platform, the chassis used for the Buick Regal, the Chevy Monte Carlo, and the Oldsmobile Cutlass, was slated for retirement. Inside Buick, this created a vacuum. Buick was historically positioned as a luxury brand, just one step below Cadillac. But luxury in the 1980s was changing. Younger buyers wanted performance, but Buick didn't have a performance engine. They didn't have a high-output V8. What they did have was a 3.8-litre V6. At the time, a V6 was considered a compromise engine, something you bought because you couldn't afford the V8. But Buick's leadership, specifically Lloyd Roos, saw a different path. If Buick couldn't have displacement, they would have technology. They decided to lean into turbocharging, a technology that was still considered exotic and somewhat unreliable in the domestic market. This led to the birth of the Grand National in 1982, and its more famous all-black iteration in 1984. It was a success, but it was a hedge. Buick was essentially saying, we know the rear-wheel drive platform is dying, so let's see how much we can get out of it before it goes. However, by 1987, the end was truly near. The G-body Regal was being replaced by a front-wheel drive version for the 1988 model year. The engineers at Buick wanted to send the platform off with a grand finale. They wanted to build the ultimate version of the Grand National. The problem was that General Motors had a very strict internal hierarchy. Within the halls of GM, there was an unwritten rule, often referred to as the Corvette ceiling. The Corvette was the flagship. It was the halo car for the entire corporation. Therefore, no other GM product was allowed to be faster or more powerful than the Corvette. If a Buick or an Oldsmobile started creeping into Corvette territory, the corporate brass would usually step in and detune the engine or cancel the project. Buick knew that if they tried to build the GNX entirely in-house, it would be killed by corporate oversight before it ever reached a customer. They needed to move the project off-site. They partnered with two outside firms, American Specialty Cars, ASC, and McLaren Performance Technologies. This wasn't the McLaren that builds supercars today, but an American offshoot with deep roots in racing engines. By outsourcing the development, Buick could bypass some of the internal bureaucratic hurdles. The cars would be built as standard Grand Nationals, shipped to ASC/McLaren, and transformed into GNXs. The engineering focus wasn't just on adding power, it was on solving the inherent flaws of the G-body chassis. When you put a lot of torque through a live rear axle and leaf springs, the frame tends to twist. The rear tyres hop and the car loses traction. The McLaren engineers heavily modified the rear suspension, adding a sophisticated torque arm and a panhard bar to the existing setup. This was designed to mimic the geometry of a race car, keeping the rear axle centred and pushing the tyres into the pavement rather than letting the body lift. Then they turned to the turbocharger. They replaced the standard unit with a Garrett T3 that featured a ceramic turbine wheel. Ceramic is significantly lighter than the heavy metal alloys used in traditional turbos. Because it has less mass, it has less inertia. This meant the turbo could spool up much faster, nearly eliminating the turbo lag that plagued 1980s performance cars. When they were finished, the car was a mechanical masterpiece, but it created a massive political liability. Buick officially rated the GNX at 276 horsepower and 360 pound-feet of torque. In reality, these numbers were widely believed to be an intentional underestimation. Independent dyno tests showed the car was actually producing well over 300 horsepower. Buick had likely underrated the car to avoid the Corvette ceiling, but the track times told a different truth. If you don't want to miss out on anything cars, make sure to subscribe. When the GNX hit the streets, Chevrolet was furious. Their brand new C4 Corvette was being embarrassed at stoplights by a Buick, a car that shared its basic body shell with a vehicle used by rental car companies and grandmothers. The corporate reaction was swift. GM leadership restricted the production of the GNX to just 547 units. They also ensured that Buick was limited in how they could market the car. There were no flashy television commercials. There was no massive PR push. The car was essentially treated like a secret that GM wanted to go away as quickly as possible. This lack of official support had an unintended consequence. Because the car wasn't being marketed to the typical country club Buick buyer, it began to develop a mysterious, almost underground reputation. It became known as Darth Vader's car. The design played into this. By deleting all the chrome and using a monochromatic black palette, Buick had accidentally created an aesthetic that felt industrial and aggressive. It didn't look like a luxury car, and it didn't look like a traditional muscle car with racing stripes and bright colours. It looked like a tool built for a single violent purpose. This anti-luxury aesthetic started to resonate in a place Buick never expected: the emerging hip-hop scene and urban centres of New York and Los Angeles. In the late 80s and early 90s, status symbols in hip-hop were evolving. While many were gravitating toward the obvious flash of Mercedes or BMW, a subset of the culture began to prize the GNX. The reason was twofold. First, there was the technical superiority. In a culture that valued street cred and the ability to win a confrontation, the GNX was the ultimate sleeper. It could outrun the police, and it could outrun the flashy sports cars of the wealthy elite. It was a high-tech weapon disguised in a familiar, gritty American shape. Second, there was the exclusivity, because GM had capped production at 547 units. Owning a GNX meant you were part of a very small circle. It wasn't just about having money, it was about having the knowledge to find one. The GNX began appearing in music videos and lyrics. It became the villain car. It represented a specific kind of power, one that was quiet, dark, and didn't care about social approval. It was a rejection of the doctor's car image. By the time the 1990s were in full swing, the GNX had transitioned from a corporate embarrassment to a cultural icon. It was a status symbol for people who identified with being an outsider. But even as the car's legend grew, Buick itself was moving in the opposite direction. The rear-wheel drive platform was gone. The turbocharging experiment was largely mothballed in favour of more conservative engines. Buick went back to being the brand of comfort and predictability. Looking back, the story of the GNX is usually told as a triumph of engineering. People point to the 0 to 60 times and the McLaren partnership as proof of what Buick could do when they were let off the leash. But that interpretation misses the most important part of the business strategy. The GNX wasn't a halo car designed to bring people into dealerships to buy Les Sabres. If that were the case, GM would have built thousands of them and run ads during the Super Bowl. The GNX was also not a sustainable business model. Buick knew they were never going to build another rear-wheel drive performance car like it. The engineers and designers at Buick knew their world was ending. They knew the Corvette ceiling was a glass roof designed to keep them in their place. They knew that within 2 years, their division would be forced to build front-wheel drive family cars for the rest of their careers. The GNX exists because a small group of people decided that if they were going to be forced into obsolescence, they were going to go out by breaking every rule in the company handbook. They purposely built a car that was faster than the flagship. They purposely collaborated with outsiders to hide their work. They purposely underrated the horsepower to avoid triggering a corporate veto from GM's higher-ups. The reason the GNX feels different from every other car of that era, and the reason it resonated so deeply with a culture that prized rebellion, is because the car itself was a mutiny. It wasn't built to save a brand or to make a profit. It was built to prove that the hierarchy was wrong. The GNX remains an icon today, not because it was a great Buick, but because it was a car that refused to be a Buick at all. It was the moment the doctor's car decided to stop following orders. Don't forget to subscribe to not miss anything cars and business.